Can I thank the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition for their perhaps over-generous remarks about my role, and simply to underline that there were many, many tens of thousands of activists in the anti-apartheid movement who deserve to be acknowledged as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your personal leadership in ensuring that this tribute debate is such a special event, as you said, for such a special person, and I note that you're wearing the South African tie on this occasion. And specifically, and this is very important, for proposing Thursday afternoon's Westminster Hall event for civil society, along with the Lord Speaker, including, importantly, veteran activists of the anti-apartheid movement who worked so tirelessly over many tough and bitter decades for both Nelson Mandela's release and for the sanctions against apartheid that he wanted and which ultimately triggered his freedom. Mr. Speaker, I've never really been into heroes, but Nelson Mandela was mine from when I was a young boy in Pretoria, unique amongst my school friends, relatives as well, in having parents who welcomed everybody to their house regardless of their colour, activists in the anti-apartheid struggle. One fellow activist, Elliot Ngadi, I remember, remarked, "This is the first time I've ever come through the front door of a white man's house." Blacks acting as servants or gardeners might be allowed in the back door occasionally. My mother Adelaine was often alone in the whites-only section of the public gallery at Nelson Mandela's 1962 trial in Pretoria, and when he entered the dock, he would always acknowledge her with a clenched fist, which she would return. His beautiful wife, Winnie, attended the trial each day, often magnificent in tribal dress. Once, when my tiny younger sisters went with my mother on a school holiday, Winnie bent down and kissed the two little blonde girls, to the very evident horror of the onlooking white policeman. A black woman kissing two little white children disgusted them. 40 years later, I was escorting Nelson Mandela to speak at the Labour Party annual conference in Brighton, but before that he had an appointment with the Prime Minister which was very carefully scheduled. And we were going down in the lift in the hotel, and he said, "How's the family?" And I mentioned that my mother had broken her leg and was in hospital. "Ah," he said, "I must phone her." The Prime Minister was kept waiting, while Nelson Mandela chatted to porters and cleaners and waitresses and waiters all lined up. As the minutes ticked by and I desperately tried Director of Inquiries to get her phone number, eventually got the ward, I was put through, and I said to her, "There's a very special person would like to speak to you." Handed the phone to him. He said, "This is Mandela from South Africa. Do you know who I am?" Having been sentenced to 5 years on Robben Island after that Pretoria trial that my mother attended, he was then brought back over a year later, as has been mentioned, to be accused number one in the Rivonia trial, when facing the death penalty and against the strong advice of his lawyer, he famously said, "During my lifetime, I've dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people. I fought against white domination and I fought against black domination. I've cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I'm prepared to die." I remember reading these powerful words at age 14, tried to take in their full significance, and aware they were a great inspiration to my parents and all involved in the anti-apartheid struggle as he faced the death penalty. In fact, after worldwide pleas for clemency, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, and in July 1964, Mandela returned to Robben Island, not to be seen or heard in public again for nearly 26 years. 2 years later, in 1966, my parents, having previously been jailed, declared banned persons and deprived of earning a living, our family sailed past Robben Island into exile here in Britain, and we'll always be grateful for the welcome we were given in this country. And I remember looking out over the Cape Rollers and imagining how Mandela and his comrades were surviving in that cold, bleak cell. As an African, he was permitted 5 ounces of meat daily, where coloureds were allowed 6 ounces. he was permitted ½ an ounce of fat, coloureds 1 ounce. The evil precision of apartheid penetrated every nook and cranny of life, banning interracial sex, park benches, sport, jobs, schools, and hospitals, and much, much more. The apartheid state had hoped that out of sight on the former leper colony of Robben Island, with its freezing cold waters that had devoured all escapees, he would be out of mind. But the longer he was imprisoned, the bigger a global leader he became. By July 1988, his 70th birthday became a global celebration with a pulsating Free Mandela anti-apartheid rock concert attended by 100,000 people at Wembley Stadium and watched on live television by 600 million worldwide. Despite, I say for the record, Mr. Speaker, not out of any recrimination, some Conservative members pressing for the BBC to pull the plug on its coverage. And then, almost miraculously, was something we had never dreamed of, but deep down doubted would ever happen. That historic day in February 1990, when he walked out of prison to freedom, an image forever imprinted on me and on millions, perhaps even billions, across the world. I say almost miraculously because history gets compressed and rewritten over time, and we take change for granted. The reality was very different. Nelson Mandela's struggle for freedom and that of his African National Congress was long and it was bitter, taking nearly 100 years from the days that under British colonial rule the roots of apartheid were established. Under Britain in 1900, 50 years before apartheid was formally institutionalized in South Africa, most of apartheid's features were already in place in the bustling gold rush city of Johannesburg. By then, Africans were already prevented from walking on the pavements. They had to walk in the streets, had to carry passes to work in the city, could not use buses and trains designated for whites, were dreadfully exploited in the mines, and had no political rights. We all say in Britain we were against apartheid, and doubtless we were. But some did things about it, others didn't. The anti-apartheid struggle was for most of its life engaged in a big fight. Here in Britain too, its executive secretaries, first Ethel de Keyser, then Mike Terry, indefatigable. Its chairman, Lord Bob Hughes, and treasurer Richard Cabourn, former members of this House, were real stalwarts, and Neil Kinnock, along with Glenys as well. Protests to stop whites-only Springbok tours provoked fierce anger. I remember it well. Pain the pain, as I recall. Some people might still feel that. Yet, as Nelson Mandela confirmed to me, their sporting isolation, the Springbok sporting isolation, was a key factor in making whites realize that they had to change, so that today that wonderful black rugby star Brian Habana can be a Springbok when his predecessors under apartheid at the time we were demonstrating never could. Demands for trade and economic sanctions were also resisted, yet their partial implementation, regrettably not by London but by Washington, eventually helped propel the white business community in the late 1980s to demand change from the very same apartheid government from which they had so long benefited. Mr. Speaker, forgive me if for a brief moment I strike what I hope won't be seen as too discordant a note on this occasion, which sees the House at its very best coming together to salute a great man. Were it not for the interventions in the media in recent days, I'd have let pass correcting the historical record. I give credit especially to you, Mr. Speaker, for volunteering most graciously that you were on the wrong side of the anti-apartheid struggle as a young Conservative. I give credit to the Prime Minister for apologising for his party's record of what I have to describe as craven indulgence towards apartheid's rulers. And if Nelson Mandela can forgive his oppressors without forgetting their crimes, who am I not to do the same for our opponents in the long decades of the anti-apartheid struggle? But it really does stick in the craw when Lord Tebbit, Charles Moore and others similar have tried over recent days to claim that their complicity with apartheid because that's what I think it was, somehow brought about its end. Even to my utter incredulity, when Lord Tebbit told BBC World in a debate with me that they had brought about Mandela's freedom. I know for a fact that Nelson Mandela did not think so. On every possible opportunity, he went out of his way to thank anti-apartheid activists across the world for freeing him and his people. It's therefore especially welcome that Nelson Mandela always retained an almost touching faith in British parliamentary democracy, even though, and I disagree with the interpretation by the Right Honourable Member for Kensington, even though by force of circumstances, over most of his life he was a believer in non-violent, legal, peaceful change. By force of circumstances, the suppression of his African National Congress's non-violent campaign for over 60 years. He had to become a freedom fighter, to lead an underground campaign of guerrilla activity similar to the French resistance against the Nazis. Yeah. And even when the majority in this Parliament and the government of the day was not on his side, he still cherished our parliamentary democracy. I mention this because Mandela's old foes became his new friends, his former adversaries, his admirers. That was part, as others have said, of his greatness. But that was Mandela, the political leader. There was another, as my right honourable friend, the member for Dunfermline, in his marvellous speech has remarked, another equally engaging side to his greatness. He had an infectious capacity for mischief. In London, a few weeks after our marriage in 2003, I introduced my wife Elizabeth to him. "Is this your girlfriend?" he asked. When I replied, "No, she's my wife," he chuckled, "So she caught you then?" And when Elizabeth, who can be somewhat feisty at times, exclaimed indignantly that she'd taken a lot of persuading, he laughed. "That's what they all say, Peter. But they trap you in the end." By then, she realized that he was teasing her, and we all ended up laughing together. He had apologized earlier for not coming to our wedding, instead sending a message which contained these impish words to us newlyweds. "But perhaps I'll be able to come next time." It was not just his towering stature, his courage and capacity to inspire that endeared Nelson Mandela to so many. Despite being one of the world's most prominent statesmen, perhaps the most revered, he retained his extraordinary humanity. When he was with you, you had all his attention. When he greeted you, his eyes never wandered, even though you were surrounded by far more important people. Whether you were a mere child, a hotel porter, a cleaner, a waiter, or a junior staff member, he was interested in you, and he never forgot a friend. On the same occasion Elizabeth met him in 2003, my parents were also present, enjoying a reunion. The conversation somehow turned to my ministerial driver, whom he promptly summoned up. "I was once a driver too," Mandela told him as they shook hands, referring to the time in 1961-62 when he was on the run underground, dubbed the Black Pimpernel, often moving about the country, and in order to invite no attention, dressed as a chauffeur with cap and uniform, his white master in the back, stereotypical in those days, and a good form of disguise, that chauffeur's uniform. An ordinariness combined with extraordinariness is not Mandela's sole uniqueness. His capacity for forgiveness is what made him the absolutely critical figure, first during secret negotiations in the late 1980s from prison with the Afrikaner nationalist government, and then after his release, both in the transition and in healing a bitterly divided nation. Which then brings me to his status. Gandhi, Kennedy, Churchill, all iconic figures. The last for his inspirational wartime leadership, the first more so for being assassinated. Yet today, ask almost anybody anywhere which global statesman they admire most, and Nelson Mandela will likely as not be the answer. Other world figures are usually famous within their own professional disciplines, sections of society, interest groups, or age groups. Many attract hostility or cynicism or plain indifference. Nelson Mandela's unique achievement was to command fame, admiration, and affection from virtually everyone, anywhere in the world. So if, as I believe, he's more iconic than anybody else, then why? His life story of sacrifice, courage, endurance, and suffering in the great and noble cause of liberty, democracy, and justice places him alongside a very select few: Tolpuddle martyrs, Chartists, suffragettes, Gandhi himself, anti-colonial African leaders, Che Guevara, Lech Walesa, Solzhenitsyn, Aung San Suu Kyi, to name just some. But Mandela towers above all of them in popular imagination. Perhaps in part because he was the first such figure to be projected to the world's peoples through the powerful media of the modern global television and the internet. He was quite simply far better known than any comparable figure. But equally he survived, and this is the lesson I draw, he survived and indeed prospered even under the fierce media spotlight of 24-hour news, overhype and spin, where uniquely he remained untarnished and undiminished. That modern media beast's unrivaled capacity for building up, then knocking down, leaving him serenely above all its insatiable prurience and obsession for triviality and instant novelty. Where most political careers end in failure or opprobrium, Nelson Mandela's continued to soar long after he'd stepped down as president. Mandela's greatness, his stature, derived not just from an extraordinary biography that dwarfs the rest of humankind. It came from the warm glow of humanity that he radiated, his common touch, his humbleness, self-deprecation, humor, and dignity. Prison could have embittered, adulation could have gone to his head, egotism could have triumphed. The clutching of the crowd and the intrusive pressures of the modern political age could have seen him retreat behind the barriers which most leaders and celebrities today, not necessarily through any fault of their own, erect around themselves, partly to retain some personal space, but the consequence of which all too often becomes either aloofness or insincerity and its companion, cynicism. But none of this happened to him. Throughout everything, Nelson Mandela remained his own man, not seduced by the trappings of office, nor deluded by the adulation of admirers, always friendly and approachable. And that's why he was, for me, the icon of icons, and maybe always will be. President Bill Clinton, who has such a wonderful way with words, said this: "Every time Nelson Mandela walks into a room, we all feel a little bigger. We all want to stand up, we all want to cheer because we'd like to be him, like him on our best day." Sadly, Nelson Mandela won't be walking into our rooms ever again, but we can all still strive to be like him on our best days. For as he said in one of his memorable proverbs, "What counts in life is not the mere fact that we've lived, it is what difference we've made to the lives of others." Yeah.